Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's huge, aiming to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa with all these infrastructure projects. And we're going to be digging into a YouTube video featuring a geopolitical expert named Kishore Mahbubani, who gives a perspective you might not hear every day.
Yeah, Mahbubani really challenges some of the common ideas about the BRI, particularly that whole debt trap thing.
Right, that whole narrative that it's designed to give China control over other countries.
Yeah, debt trap diplomacy, it's often called. The idea being that China intentionally burdens these countries with loans that they can't possibly repay.
And then swoops in to seize assets when they default.
Exactly.
So is Mahbubani saying that's not happening at all?
He argues that the Western media often focuses on the negative examples while totally ignoring the successes and the positive impacts of the BRI.
Okay, so what are some of those successes? He must have some evidence to back up these claims, right?
He does. He brings up this Sri Lankan port deal, for example, which is often held up as like a classic example of debt trap diplomacy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that one. Didn't China end up taking control of the port because Sri Lanka couldn't pay back the loans?
That's the common story, but Mahbubani presents a different perspective. He points out that Sri Lanka actually ended up with a functional port without having to make a huge initial investment.
Interesting.
There were definitely some struggles at first, but Sri Lanka ultimately benefited from the deal.
So it wasn't really a trap after all.
Well, Mahbubani argues that it actually flipped the script on who was taking on the risk, because now China has to figure out how to make the port profitable.
Ah, I see. So they're not just calling the shots and getting their way all the time.
Right, and this adaptability is something we see in other BRI projects too, like the Malaysian East-West Railway project, for example. It also ran into some problems early on, but the key takeaway here is that China was willing to renegotiate and find a solution that worked for both sides.
So it's more about collaboration than domination.
Exactly. They're open to compromise.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, can we define a couple of key terms? We keep hearing about geopolitical anxieties and tectonic shifts in the global landscape. What do those even mean in this context?
Sure. Geopolitical anxieties basically refer to those concerns about how the balance of power is shifting around the world.
Because for a long time, Western nations have been the ones calling the shots.
Right. They've been the dominant players for centuries. But with China's economic and political rise, that dominance is being challenged.
So some countries are feeling a little threatened by China's influence.
Exactly. And that leads to what we call a tectonic shift in the global landscape. Like the ground is literally shifting and everyone's trying to adjust to this new reality.
Okay, that's a helpful image. It makes sense why there's so much discussion and debate around the BRI then.
Yeah, the BRI is kind of a symbol of this shift. And it's forcing the world to reevaluate its relationship with China.
So we're not just talking about building roads and bridges. We're talking about reshaping the whole global order.
In a way, yes. And that's why it's important to understand the BRI from multiple perspectives. We can't reduce it to one simple narrative.
Right. Speaking of simple narratives, let's dig a little deeper into Mahbubani's arguments against that whole debt trap idea. What else does he have to say about that?
He actually gives several examples that really challenge the prevailing narrative.
Oh, okay. Like what? I'm curious to hear what evidence he presents.
Well, he points to the Uzbekistan railway project. This was a massive undertaking. They built a high-speed rail line through those challenging mountains.
Wow, that sounds pretty ambitious.
And they completed it in just 900 days.
900 days. That's incredibly fast.
Right. It really shows China's engineering capabilities.
It does. And what about Uzbekistan? What was the impact on them?
For them, it's been a game changer. The railway has dramatically improved connectivity within the country, leading to all sorts of positive economic outcomes.
So this is a case where the BRI is bringing tangible benefits beyond just the infrastructure itself.
Exactly. And there are many more examples like this.
Well, let's hear them. This is definitely more nuanced than how the media usually portrays it.
I agree. And that's really what Mahbubani is trying to do, encourage a more balanced and informed discussion.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these other success stories. So we're seeing that there's another side to this Belt and Road story, right? Not just the debt trap narrative. Does Mahbubani give us any other examples that challenge that perception?
He does. He actually mentions speaking with people from Nigeria and Kenya.
Oh, wow.
And they talked about their own experiences with these BRI projects.
Okay.
And it's really interesting because their perspective is so different from what you often hear in Western media.
So what did they have to say about it?
They basically said that the BRI projects have had a much more positive impact on their lives than, like, the aid they've received from Western nations.
Oh, that's a really interesting comparison.
Yeah, it really highlights how important it is to consider the perspective of the people who are actually being impacted by these projects,
Mm.
not just, those observing from afar.
Right. You can't really understand what it's like until you've experienced it firsthand.
Exactly. And speaking of seeing things firsthand, the China-Africa summit,
Yeah.
that was another big indicator that in many parts of the world, the BRI is being received pretty positively.
All those leaders gathering to talk about collaborating with China.
Right. I mean, they wouldn't be so eager to partner with China if they really felt like it was just about creating debt traps.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It seems like these African nations see some real value in this partnership with China.
Okay, but let's talk about the debt issue for a second. Even if it's not always a trap, isn't there a risk that these BRI loans could put countries in a tough spot if they can't keep up with the repayments?
Yeah, it's a valid concern, and the video does acknowledge that debt sustainability is a critical aspect of the BRI. But Mahbubani argues that if we just focus on the amount of debt, we're kind of missing the bigger picture. Because the whole point of the BRI is to help these developing countries address their huge need for infrastructure.
Right, they need roads, railways, ports, all that stuff.
Exactly. And he says we need to focus on the purpose of those loans.
Not just how much is owed.
Right. Think about it. If you don't have reliable transportation, internet access, or even electricity, how are you supposed to develop and compete in the global economy?
Yeah, it's like trying to run a race with your legs tied together.
Exactly. And the BRI is trying to address those fundamental needs.
So he's saying that the focus should be on the long-term economic benefits that come with good infrastructure.
Yes. And the video actually highlights several BRI projects that have done just that.
Okay, give me some examples. I'm curious to hear about these success stories.
Sure. One example is the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway in Kenya. This is a Chinese-funded project that resulted in this modern railway that significantly cut down the travel time between those two cities.
So what was the impact of that?
It led to a big boost in trade and tourism.
And overall economic growth.
Right. So it was a win-win for both Kenya and China.
Okay, what about in other parts of the world?
Well, there's the Piraeus port in Greece.
Oh, yeah, that rings a bell.
That's a great example of how BRI investments can actually revitalize existing infrastructure.
So it's not just about building new things from scratch.
No. And after this Chinese investment, the Piraeus port became the busiest port in the entire Mediterranean,
Wow.
bringing lots of jobs and revitalizing the local economy.
So even developed nations are participating in the BRI?
That's right. It's not just about China investing in developing countries.
Got it. And what about newer projects?
Well, there's also the Last China Railway.
Oh, yeah, I think I heard about that. It's relatively new, right?
Yeah, it opened just a couple of years ago, and it's expected to be a huge boost to Laos's economy by, facilitating trade and tourism.
Okay, so it seems like there are definitely some positive outcomes here. But what about those concerns about debt sustainability? Like, how does China handle those when they come up?
Well, that's where that adaptability we talked about comes in. China's actually shown that they're willing to renegotiate loans and work with countries to find solutions when debt becomes an issue.
So it's not like they just give the money and walk away?
No, not at all. They seem committed to the long-term success of these projects. Like, for example, they restructured $4 billion of railway debt in Ethiopia to make the repayments more manageable.
Okay, so they're willing to adjust the terms if needed.
Yes. And there's also Zambia,
Right.
which has benefited from these debt relief initiatives.
Led by the G20.
Yeah, and China has been participating in those.
So it's definitely more complicated than people might think. The BRI is not just a debt trap, after all.
Right. It's this whole multifaceted thing with both potential benefits and risks.
Okay, I'm getting that now. It's not just black and white.
And Mahbubani says it's really important to acknowledge both the challenges and the benefits.
To look at it with a balanced view.
Exactly.
Okay, but I'm still kind of stuck on that whole debt trap label.
Yeah.
It feels like there's more to say about that. Like, you mentioned the Sri Lankan port deal earlier. What else did Mahbubani say about that?
Oh, he actually uses that port as an example to kind of debunk that whole debt trap narrative.
The Hambantota port, right?
Yeah, the one that was often used to say that China was seizing assets when countries couldn't repay loans.
That was the story that was going around, yeah.
Well, what Mahbubani says is that the port was actually leased to a Chinese company.
Leased, not seized.
Exactly. It was a commercial agreement, not some kind of aggressive power play.
So it was more of a business transaction than a debt trap.
Exactly. And I think it highlights how important it is to look beyond those headlines. You really have to understand the details of these financial arrangements.
Right, because the reality is often way more complicated than those simple narratives.
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like the BRI is not just this monolithic thing where every project is either a success or a disaster.
Right. It's this vast and complex initiative with a whole range of outcomes,
And it makes sense that there will be challenges along the way.
of course.
But the point is to approach it with this balanced perspective.
Right. Acknowledge both the potential risks and the potential rewards.
Okay, I think we're finally getting somewhere. Are we ready to move past this whole debt trap back and forth now? Like, there's got to be more to discuss about the BRI.
Of course. There's so much more. Mahbubani brings up some really interesting points about how the BRI is affecting global dynamics.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into those complexities then. See what else we can learn about this whole thing. Okay, so we've unpacked a lot about this Belt and Road Initiative, right? We've gone beyond just those headlines and really trying to get a clearer picture. And it seems like it's more than just debt traps and power struggles.
Right. Yeah, it really is. The BRI is so multifaceted. Mahbubani gets into some fascinating points that I think often get overlooked. Like, he talks about how the BRI represents this fundamental shift in the global balance of power. And this shift, understandably, faces pushback, especially from Western nations.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Western nations have been the dominant force in the world for centuries.
Exactly.
So the idea of China rising, both economically and, geopolitically, that's got to cause some anxiety.
For sure. It challenges those long-held assumptions about who's in charge, who gets to set the rules. And that kind of change can be unsettling, even threatening to some.
It's like the whole world is going through this massive earthquake, and we're all trying to find our footing.
I love that analogy. And the BRI is kind of the epicenter of that earthquake. It's a real tangible symbol of China's growing influence, and it's forcing the world to really rethink how they relate to China.
So it's not just about building things, it's about like reshaping the world as we know it.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to really think about the complexities of the BRI and what it all means.
Because whether we see it as a threat or an opportunity, it's here to stay. And its impact is going to be felt for a long time.
For decades.
So the more we know, the better prepared we'll be.
Right, we have to move beyond the fear-mongering and really engage in honest, open discussions about how to make this work.
Because it's not about taking sides.
No.
It's about understanding the different perspectives and the motivations.
And making sure these projects are sustainable, transparent, beneficial to everyone involved.
So where does this leave us? We've explored the Belt and Road Initiative from different angles, we've heard from experts, and we've tried to unpack some of the myths and realities. It's clear that it's much more complicated than it's often made out to be.
Definitely. It's not just a debt trap, it's not just a power play, and it's not just a bunch of infrastructure projects. It's all of those things and more. It shows China's ambitions on the world stage. It shows their desire to change global trade and connectivity, and it shows their willingness to invest in regions that have often been ignored.
And like with any big undertaking, there will be challenges along the way.
Oh yeah, definitely. Setbacks, unintended consequences.
But there's also this potential for huge change, right? Economic growth, better standards of living in many parts of the world.
Absolutely.
So the question for all of you listening is, what does the BRI mean for you? For your country, your industry, the future you see for yourself?
It's not just happening somewhere else. It's already shaping the world, and it's only going to get bigger.
That's why it's so important to stay informed, to think critically, to form your own opinions based on a real understanding of the facts.
Don't let those headlines and those prepackaged narratives tell you what to think. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives, and ask yourself, what does the BRI really mean for the world?
And how will it shape the future we're all headed toward? That's what we've tried to do today, and we encourage you to keep exploring.
If the BRI is a reflection of China's vision for the future, what does that vision tell us about the world we're moving into? And what role do you want to play in shaping that world?
It's something to think about. It's something we'll all be dealing with as this initiative unfolds.
And its impact spreads.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep learning.